Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. Raska Kamil from Kamla Nehru College, University of Delhi. Today I'm going to discuss module Cities in History, First Urban Revolution, Greek, Roman Cities and Indian, which comes under the paper Urban Geography. First of all, let's discuss what could be the learning outcomes of this module. While going through this module, you'll be able to comprehend, study the approaches towards the city formation, understand the characteristics of ancient cities in the early civilization, features of Greek, Roman and Indian cities, and also understand the basis of city development, diffusion and decline. So let's begin. The earlier cities that emerged had the component of villages in them. With the development of skilled manpower, long distance transport and communication, newer inventions and enormous increase in agricultural productivity, they gradually assimilated into new urban units. Religion was the prime focus and it shaped the activities of people. The technological advances and politics were in a mere supporting role. The massive walls of the cities were the powerhouse. This gave rise to construction of large self-imposing temples. They contained the wealth of the city, mostly in the form of food, collected by the armed representatives of the king. In this process of accumulating more and more wealth, each city eventually became the potential booty for the others. As a result, armed guards were deployed to protect against any invasion by adjoining city-states. The village were different from the city in that they struggled to provide for not only their own family and village, but also to support the priestly and the royal class. The emergence of city also led to a distinct division of labor for its inhabitants that resulted in occupational specialization. This division or stratification was not limited to occupation alone, but also done on caste. When put in a social pyramid, the priestly and the warrior castes were at the top. Merchants and the craftsmen occupied a level below them, peasants, sailors and house servants and freedmen at the level below them, which was further below them. The slaves formed the lowest stratum of the pyramid. There emerged two points of view on the origin of cities. One, there was a single area of origin of cities, a single culture hearth. The cities have originated in the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. The city formation was diffused from Mesopotamia to the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, the Huanghe Valley, and perhaps to the Mesoamerica. The traits that have been collected so far, such as deities, an exalted ruler, and central authority, great temples, division of caste and labor, the beginning of writing and calendar matches. But those who disagree argue that these traits were too specific to have been spontaneously developed. So they must have originated in a common culture hearth and have been modified to suit each area to which they were diffused. Another approach towards origin of cities states that cities originated spontaneously in the different regions without external influence, even though the indications are that the cities in different regions were formed as much as several millennia apart. The lines of communications between the various areas involved were supposedly non-existent and transportation was not developed at the scale needed for migration or travel between those areas. The environment within which cities developed in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley and the Huanghe Valley were mostly similar in being the level floodplains and soils and climate favoring surplus agricultural production. But the cities of Mesoamerica were first developed in what might be considered as harsh environment. The agriculture was challenging, transportation was crude, and many elements of the technology of the old world were absent. A system of villages developed first in Mesopotamia. The main concentration of people, around 200 to 500 individuals, was in the hills and along the pediment of Tigris and the Euphrates River, and not along the floodplain proper. These included the earlier cities of Mesopotamia like Erech, Eridu, Ur, Lagash, and Larsa in the southernmost part of Tigris and the Euphrates River Valley, and Kish and Jemdet Nasr in the midsection of the same river valley. All of them had transformed from villages to cities. But the process of transformation was gradual and took centuries before it was complete. Each city was ruled by the king, who was also the chief priest. it was mandatory for the farming population to return the king the part of the surplus agricultural output. The surplus was stored in the main temple. It formed the main source of sustenance for the ruling group of the city. The cities founded at this time were on the sites located on the interfluves between channels of the Tigris and the Euphrates river system, which they were afforded the greatest protection from the flood and which occurred frequently. The earlier cities grew up within the walled section that had temples and formed characteristic features of Mesopotamian cities. The main dominance was of the priestly class on the social structure. They guided both the economic and the ritualistic aspects of the society. The temple palace complex was surrounded by a wall. It had a dual role, one to act as a defense against the marauders from the adjacent city-states, and two to provide protection against the recurring flood from the Tigris and the Euphrates Valley. The walls were made of fired and unfired mud bricks for most houses, temples and palaces. The arrangement of the houses were irregular. They were interrupted by open spaces in the vicinity of temples and other public buildings. Streets were narrow lanes without surfacing or proper drainage. The refuse accumulated on the lanes. The excavation of the Ur reveals one of those extreme conditions where the refuse had gradually raised the level of the streets to such an extent that houses had to be create entrance on the second level, since the original floor was below the street level. The chapels, small shops and rows of both were interspersed among the cluster of houses and were supposedly used by the merchants and artisans. The outer margin of the city was a zone where the poorest element of the population lived in the mud and huts. Farming community were settled in the periphery of the city. The cultivation of the crops within or near the margin of these cities was beneficial in that it facilitated the movement of produce to the markets in the heart of the city, as well as providing more assured food supply. The early development was also marked in the valley of Lower Nile Valley. The agglomerated settlement of the Nile Valley dates from 3500 to 400 BC. These early settlements were crude walled clustering with the dwellings like huge barracks and narrow lanes between that served as sewers as well. As in the Mesopotamia, in the Nile Valley too, the development of the walled villages took place in the delta areas of the lower river valley. The villages were clustered into politically independent units. Each had its own cooperative irrigation system for cultivation of staple grains like wheat and barley. Animals were domesticated and metallurgical tools were used. In the social sphere, there was stratification and an emerging division of labor. The earliest cities that emerged in these regions about 3100 BC were Memphis, This, Heliopolis, Nechabant, and later Thebes. The remnants of these cities have mostly been covered by the silt deposited in the annual floods of the Nile Valley. The thought on diffusion further gets credence from the certain artifacts which were found on the sides of the ancient Nile River, and they are believed to have been borrowed from Mesopotamia. It also includes the concept of early writing. There had been a more gradual transition from the village to city in the Nile Valley and in the Mesopotamia. The practice of changing the site of the capital may have resulted in the conspicuous absence in the development of large cities. Around 2900 BC, Ekheteton became the first capital while Memphis enjoyed this status after 2700 BC. About 2000 BC, Thebes became a large city and Ekheteton served as a capital for a short period. Part of the reason why traces of earlier cities in the Nile Valley are lacking may have to do with the building materials used. The type of building material used may be one of the reasons for the missing traces of the earlier cities in the Nile Valley. The materials do not readily withstand the weathering of time. Were used like the sun-dried clay bricks supplemented with wattle and daub. Later too, when the stone was used for the construction of pyramids, the houses of the people were made of perishable materials. The remnant of the cities that developed after 2000 BC indicate that multi-storied houses were fairly common. Social stratification with a slum area, a working men's section, and a core area, including a palace, temples, storehouses for the surplus food and public buildings. The streets were unsurfaced with no provision of drainage like those of the Mesopotamian streets. A third area that marked the population agglomeration originated was the upper Indus River Valley. There are a lot of evidence to support existence of numerous towns and villages in the region. The region was based on a highly productive system of agriculture that facilitated an emergence of these towns and villages. The system of irrigation and water impoundment was most likely a sophisticated system. The beginning of the settlements in this area dates from about 3300 BC. The cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the Indus Valley developed into major cities by 2500 BC. The city of Harappa was in Punjab at the headwaters of the Indus. Later, these cities rose to the status of capitals of an empire that flourished between 1500 to 2500 BC. Agriculture was supported by a system of irrigation and surpluses of wheat and barley were produced in this area. The people of the region knew the use of tools as well as domesticated animals and used the wheeled vehicles. Another great area that witnessed the origin of the earlier cities was the Vai Valley, not far from the Huanghe River in China. Towns were established about 2250 BC in this region. The level of technology was lower than in the other areas of the city origin. There was no evidence of use or knowledge of metallurgy. The people produced surpluses of food like millet and domesticated animals. The first cities to have developed in China seem to have been in the Huanghe Valley, with the earliest being the city Shang on the Huanghe at Anyang. Shang civilization was based on agriculture that included cultivation of wheat, barley, millet and rice. There seems to have been water impoundment measures and canalization that resulted in increasing the productivity of the staple foodstuffs. There are evidence of domestication of animals and the wheeled vehicles. The power structure was also well defined and with a hereditary political leader and nobility. The city of Mesoamerica appears to have originated centuries preceding Christian era. The advanced communities had been developed in the pre-Columbian times by the people indigenous to this region, notably the Maya, Zapotes, Mixtecs and Aztecs. There was development of class structure. The leadership was provided by the priestly class. None of the cities that developed in this region exists today. Some were said to be submerged beneath the floodwaters, some gradually disintegrated, and others were buried by the accumulation of salt and silt. The earliest cities did not occupy large amount of area, nor did they have population that today would have been considered large. Mohenjo-daro on the Indus River covered around 600 acres of land. Ur, with its canals, harbors and temples, occupied 200 acres. With its population as high as 24,000 people, Nineveh included about 1,800 acres of land area. Crowdedness, congestion, slums, pollution had been the urban problems since these cities were first formed. After the rise of Islam, about 7th century AD, a host of new cities were established in the Central Asia. As a part of the Arab extension of the city building, there was an establishment of cities in the North Africa and later along the East African coast. The cities formed during this period were Timbuktu, Kano, Kilwa, Mombasa and Jeddah. In the Europe, cities were formed by the Greeks including Sparta, Corinth, Megara, Byzantium and Athens by the 8th century BC. During the same period, Etruscans developed the centers of Veii, Pisa and Siena, among others. Rome threw the Etruscans' dominance about 500 BC and became the seat of empire that advanced the urban frontier to the north and the west. Greek city-states established colonies on the north side of the Mediterranean in Italy, Spain and Gaul, and north of the Black Sea as well. Athens had outgrown their limited food supplies and could exist only by trade. The colonies supposedly provided them with the foodstuff in exchange for certain manufactured goods such as woolens, wine, silver, pottery and metal articles. The food-based products was also provided by the non-colonies, but not on mutual trade, rather on plunder. The Romans extended the city formation into England and to the Rhine Valley in the Western Europe. into the Central Europe and the Balkans. Many of the contemporary cities had their origin during this era of Roman city building, including New York, London, Brussels, Utrecht, Cologne, Strasbourg, Paris, Bordeaux, Vienna and Belgrade. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, the city life in the Western Europe declined. Nonetheless, only a portion of the Europe under the Byzantine or the Muslim influence had an urban life. During the post-Roman period, the cities of the Western Europe declined. This was mainly due to their trade routes being obliterated by the Germanic invaders. However, a number of Roman cities sustained. There arose religious administrative centers that were ringed by the settlement of merchants and artisans. These centers eventually evolved into strong cities once again. The members of the nobility established themselves on the old Roman sites. They built fortified strongholds that attracted people to them. Such was the genesis of cities like Antwerp, Frankfurt, Prague, Warsaw. After the 9th and the 10th centuries, there was a great political stability and the kingdoms were consolidated. Cities achieving a new prominence at this time included Venice, Liege, Cologne, Utrecht, Paris and Toulouse. The northern Europe that remained free of the Roman domination, the first appearance of the cities was delayed until the 20th century. As a result of Greek colonization, the city life in the European and Russia originated in about 8th century BC. But it was not until the period between 600 to 1100 AD that any cities of consequences were found. Examples include Kiev, Novgorod and Rostov. Until the 13th century, the development of Moscow did not assume urban character, although earlier it had a citadel and the Kremlin was its nucleus. In the Indus Valley, there was a demise of cities for about a millennium. By about 6th century BC, under the Aryan control, there was reappearance of city formation. By about 4th century BC, cities included Takshila, Kashi, that is Banaras, Champa, Kampila and Patliputra in Patna. By the end of the 4th century BC, urbanization had been extended to the south. New cities formed until the era of Muslim rule, which began in the 8th century. But by the 17th century, Muslim empire was fading and the cities arose under the influence of the European colonists such as Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. There were also rise of the colonies in Southeast Asia like that of Singapore, Rangoon and Manila. In the period from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD, the major surge of city formation in China and most of East Asia. The cities formed included Suzhou, Liangqiao, Canton, Nanking, Chengdu. At the time of the Mongol invasion, after the period of dormancy, city formation began afresh and cities such as Hangzhou, Yunnan-fu, Shenyang came into existence. By the end of the 13th century, major cities of China had been established. Only exceptions were Shanghai and Hong Kong that were formed during the time of the European colonization. Japan is said to owe its urbanization to the diffusion from the Chinese mainland. City formation in Japan began in about 400 AD with Osaka as a major center. There was a decline of the city life after an early surge of city formation and was replaced in the late 14th century by the renewal of the urban activity. By about the 16th century, the landscape was dominated with castle towns such as Edo, that's Tokyo, and Hiroshima, each with a population running in thousands. In Mesoamerica, the early groups such as the Mayas and the Zaptics continued to spread the development of the urban center. The Spanish conquest in the 16th century later brought about a drastic cultural change in the remaining cities of the earlier eras. The cities that so formed were established in the European tradition and character. Let's discuss the basis of city development, diffusion and decline. Two factors were instrumental in providing the basis of the city development or formation. One is technology and the second social structure. There had to be means or mechanisms of providing surplus food supplies and raw material to support a non-agricultural population. Invention of iron and its working technique enhanced the development of urban society. The use of iron provided for a cheaper implements. The availability of iron tools was first evidenced in the agriculture, where iron plough replaced those of bronze, stone or wood and improved vehicles. provided for better transportation to ship food and other goods to the markets in the city. There was also improvisation in irrigation, weaving techniques and making of coined money. These developments facilitated not only expansion of agricultural areas but also saw increase in the food surpluses. This in turn meant more territory under control and increased ability to support the non-agricultural population. In addition to the advances in the technology, there was a need of a power structure that could organize, channel and exploit these advances. There were fortified palaces to protect the ruling class from the marauders and invaders, and invariably these were the focal points of transportation and communication. The economic support broadens as a city broadens its political control. This helps cities to then use the resource base of an enlarged hinterland and can maintain the expand trade routes. The rise or decline of a city may also be due to the factors other than technological advancement or a deep-seated power structure. Also, the vagaries of the physical environment can lead to the sudden or prolonged demise of the city, as in the case of the Pompeii, destroyed by the volcanic eruptions, and Kish, that was submerged by the changes in the course of the Euphrates River. The most important city in India is Delhi. It has grown on the river Jamuna in the relatively narrow neck of the fertile land between the Thar Desert to the southwest and the Great Himalayan Barrier to the northeast. Here also a corridor diverged to the southwest to Baroda and the Gulf of Cambay. The numerous conquerors who poured into India by the way of Khyber Pass inevitably took the route through Delhi, so that this district has some claims to be called the cockpit of India. The early history of the Delhi dates back to the 11th century AD. A number of conquerors destroyed their predecessors' cities and built capitals of their own. Some of these ancient cities are indicated in the map in the figure 6 by the numbers 1 to 7. The site labeled 7 was chosen by Shah Jahan about 1650. Most of the earlier cities were to the south of the modern Delhi, some of them as much as 4 miles to the south. The country is relatively flat and the river itself is perhaps the main controlling factor in settling these towns, since it had varied in course considerably. To the north is the ridge, which is an outlying spur of the Aravalli Hill, rising about 60 feet above the plains. Here the British troops under Nicholson were encamped during the siege, which lasted for 3 months. The blowing up of the Kashmir Gate enabled the British to capture the mutineers in the Indian city. The hall of the audience was in the former palace, which is now called the fort. Here was the famous Peacock Throne. The native city has been described as the huddle of the houses and streets diversified by splendid mosques. The main street, Chandni Chowk, running east and west from the fort, was however a broad avenue with a double row of trees down the center. From the Delhi radiates railway to all the parts of India. In 1911, it was decided to construct a new city as a center of Indian administration. This interesting planned city is called New Delhi. It was largely designed by Sir Edward Luton, who followed it in some respect the pattern of Washington. A striking rock was chosen as the site for the main buildings, and a mall leads from this to Jamuna. Now let's look at the structural component of the ancient city. One of the structural elements of the ancient city was the walled citadel, often ringed by one or more settlements. The wall provided protection to the ruling group contained within its confines. However, it did not express the limits of the city expansion, for much of the population lived outside its protection. The walled citadel consisted of prominent structures that contained the treasures of the society and surplus food. It also provided for living space for the powerful. The citadel was located on the mount of the earth, which gave it a more imposing appearance. The Acropolis, located atop a rugged cliff, was surrounded by a wall. It was a focus of a ritualistic event involving processions that would make their way up the cliff to the Acropolis. Though the Acropolis was splendid in architectural splendor, the homes outward from its base were mud huts. They were arrayed in a disorganized manner along the narrow lanes. These lanes also acted as sanitary sewers. Even though the Acropolis served as a lofty meeting place dedicated to the sacrifice and prayer to the god, there was a need of meeting place for the secular assembly and transactions, and that resulted in shaping Agora. It was a place of assembly of town people and also of settlement of minor judicial matters. The early Agora had an irregular form. It was at times an open square and at other a widening street. The original Agora was an open space, publicly owned and used for public purposes, but was not enclosed. The Agora was ringed with temporary stalls and craftsmen's workshop. From the 7th century on, with the introduction of stamped coins, commerce gained importance and economic activities expanded. As the Agora became a type of marketplace, it also retained its role as an open place, and this social function of the Agora was retained in the later cities, but with a new name such as plaza or piazza or campo. Another element unique to some early cities of the Greek culture, which had endured over the centuries, is the gridiron plan. The gridiron plan was employed by Hippodamus, a Greek planner, in the development of several Greek cities. It involved two major thoroughfares that intersected in the centers of the city with agora, major public building and temple placed around that intersection. One component of the Roman city not found in the Greek cities was that of thermae or public baths. They were said to have established as early as 33 BC. These tended to be lavish and luxurious buildings. The public bath building was a vast enclosure containing several pools and massage rooms and rooms for partaking of food. Often the public baths had attached gymnasia and play fields. At first, when the construction was conceived, there was a separation of men and women in the baths. But gradually they emerged as a common space and turned into places of drunkenness and debauchery as the sexes became intermixed. Another urban component that was characteristic of the Rome was insula, the rough representation of cities in the recent past as well as the present. Each insula was a group of dwelling units of far less privileged elements of the Roman society. It was several stories high. A height limitation was put on them. Their structure was poorly built with wood, which made them very vulnerable to fire as well as deterioration. Over a period of time, insula gave rise to the concept of multiple family dwelling units of poor quality. The pattern previously had been of the single family huts of poor quality. With these changes, insulae soon tended to disrupt the basic elements of the society, the family, and were quick to evolve into mass slums. That's all. Hope from this module you would have learned about ancient cities. Thank you.